Greetings, people of the internet. Welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your excellent host, Luke Johnson, coming to you, as always, from my undisclosed location in Midwest USA. And some of you may not know this about me, but when I'm not recording my podcast, I also enjoy writing. And as a writer myself, I thought it would be beneficial to both myself and the listeners to know a bit more about the history of this nation's literature. Because if one thing that history has definitely showed me is that this is a nation of storytellers. This is the country that's produced such writers as Mark Twain, Washington Irving, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Louisa May Alcott, Emily Dickinson, and countless others. And I would like to dedicate this episode to my mother, Amy, who made a point to read to me every night before I went to bed and inspired a great love of the written word into me and all her children. Well, most of them. My guess is as long as people have been able to speak, they've told stories. And these stories were passed on from one person to another. This can definitely be found in the Native American folk tales, which have been told long before Europeans ever stepped foot on the North American continent. With such famous folk tales as How the Chipmunk Got Its Stripes, and stories involving the character Coyote, and of course Raven, who was the Coyote's counterpart for the indigenous peoples of the Northwest Coast, stretching from what is today Alaska to northwestern California. And of course, there were origin stories among the natives of the plains, which explained how the world came into existence. Stories from the Comanche tribe, for example, center around the Great Spirit, which created different groups of humans, while the Sioux tribe described how the winds came into being, and together with the sun and the moon, control the universe. And I can tell you personally that these stories definitely made a lasting effect on me because I can remember reading such Native American folk tales in grade school. They were in our readers. I can remember stories like how the wood tick became flat and, other stories of that nature that explained how animals got distinctive characteristics. And when Europeans first made their way to the continental United States during the 1600s, beginning with the Jamestown colony, many of them brought over stories from the motherland, and many of them wrote them stories themselves. It all began with Captain John Smith, who might be considered the first American author, with his work, A True Relation of Virginia, which was published in 1608. And afterwards, writers began popping up like weeds during the colonial period. These earlier writers wrote about their experiences starting in the 1600s. Their literature was practical, straightforward, often derivative of the literature in Great Britain, and focused on the future. Other such writers that contributed to the image of the colonies were William Penn with his brief account of the province of Pennsylvania, and Thomas Ashe's Carolina. These were just a few of many works that praised America as a land of economic promise. And soon, writers from all over the colonies began to find inspiration for their works and began writing. Poets began writing, beginning with the first ever published American poet, Anne Bradstreet, when her book, The 10th Muse Lately Sprung Up in America, was published in 1650 in, of all places, London, England. She was also one of the first female writers to ever have a book of poetry published. And in her book, she wrote about the beauty of the colonies where she had landed, and this would be a common theme among colonial literature, along with poetry and sermons devoted to the service of God. Such preachers as Jonathan Edwards with his sermon, The Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which I remember reading in high school, and let me tell you, it was definitely a big fire and brimstone speech. I could probably see people quaking in their boots when they went to church. And many explorers wrote of their adventures on the new continent in hopes of obtaining funding and political support. And colonial leaders who were aware that they were creating a new land with a new history carefully recorded everything that occurred in their homes. And the first slave narrative was also written during this time. It was called A Narrative of the Uncommon Sufferings and Surprising Deliverance of Britton Hammond in 1760 in Boston, Massachusetts. And during this time, several American founding fathers began writing books and papers of their own. Benjamin Franklin began printing his yearly Poor Richard's Almanac in 1732 before ceasing publication in 1758. The new era began when the United States declared its independence in 1776. An important note is that much of these writings were written in the British style using British spelling and lots of flowery language. One shift that could be seen was the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, which to this day is seen as an esteemed work with wit and influence toward the formation of the budding American identity. This so-called lack of a distinctly American writing style would change after this country gained its independence. American spelling would also. Daniel Webster published his first, taking the letter U out of words like honor and color that would often be found in the traditional British spelling of those words. And of course, as I said before, our founding fathers would pick up the pen occasionally and put their thoughts on paper. As I stated before, Benjamin Franklin wrote an autobiography, and in 1787 and 1788, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay shaped the political direction of the United States with their books, the Federalist Papers. And in 1773, another important step was taken in the direction of American literature when Phyllis Wheatley, an African-American woman who was enslaved in Boston, was the first black poet in the United States to have a book of poetry published. Her first book was called Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral. And in 1789, the first American novel, The Power of Sympathy by William Hill Brown, was published. The novel tells the story of a young woman named Harriet who is pursued by two men, her guardian, a man named Mr. Boyer, and a young man named Sanford. Harriet eventually falls in love with Boyer and rejects Sanford's advances. And the first American comedy written for the stage was called The Contrast by Royal Taylor, written in 1787. One thing you may have noticed about some of the writing when America became a country, it became less and religious. The writing did, at least, and this was due to an event called the Enlightenment. During the 18th century, the Enlightenment showed a great shift in colonial American literature from a religious society to scientific reasoning applied to human nature, society, culture, and political awareness. Multiple texts were written in pamphlet or narrative form and challenged the role of God in religious life, seeking to replace them with reason. Rational thought and science were the new occurring themes. The autobiography of Benjamin Franklin and the pamphlet Common Sense by Thomas Paine explored many of these new ideas. And before I go into the next section, some of you are probably wondering what exactly makes, and I realize I also went in reverse chronology, but again, it's my podcast. I say what I want to. Constitutes American literature. Well, during the early years, it was simple, effective language that had a purpose. Some say that is still true to this day. I mean, I know I certainly definitely think that. And yes, I realize that I said something redundant, but hey, just roll with it. It's my podcast. I can say whatever I want to. And as the 1700s came to an end, we began to see a new change in American literature, and a man was born who is now considered to be the father of American literature. Now, I'm sure that most of you out there listening are probably well acquainted with stories like Rip Van Winkle, Legend of Sleepy Hollow. But did you know that the man who wrote them is often seen as the father of American literature? That's right, folks. Washington Irving is usually seen as the father of American literature. He is also thought to be the first American writer to make his living primarily through his creative work, and he is the first American to ever be acclaimed by the English literary establishment as worthy of recognition. In effect, Irving was seen as the literary declarer of independence. However, it's a rather strange label for Washington Irving, because when this country became independent, he was not at all at home with American life. And in fact, his earliest literary efforts, the Letters of Jonathan Oldstyle Gent, which were published in 1802, and Salmagundi, published in 1807, were relatively comedic glances and satirical thrusts at then contemporary New York society. And almost everyone realizes once they think about it a bit that the children's story that is his relatively best-known work, Rip Van Winkle, really expresses discontent over the fact that the Revolution marked the drastic change in America from a rather rubish yokel paradise to commercial and political babble. The birth of America in that story is really described as a fall. And really, Irving seemed more at home in the old world and spent much of his life there. American democracy was not an advance in civilization, at least as Washington Irving saw it. Irving outright mocks American government in his first major work, The History of New York, which was definitely not history, but really satire. It purported to be the history of the 3 governors, although there were actually 7, during the brief 50-year Dutch reign over New York during the early 1600s. Walter Van Twiller, he called him Walter the Doubter. William Kieft, Irving called him William the Testy. And Peter Stuyvesant, whom Irving called Peter the Headstrong. Though Irving did research about the Dutch period, there was very little factual information about these men, and the figures in the work are totally his own fabrications. Also, Irving was writing about his present as much as about his past. Twiller, for instance, depicts Marinus Willett, the mayor of New York in 1807, and Kieft was widely assumed to be a caricature of Thomas Jefferson. So, as you can see early on, we had writers basing really fictional characters on real people. So, Irving mocked history, which was especially important in the post-revolutionary period of his youth, and as a vehicle for establishing America's success story. Following Washington Irving was another American writer named James Fenimore Cooper. He spent his childhood in a peaceful environment, but once he had witnessed the scene of a Native American massacre. As a boy, he witnessed Native Americans and frontiersmen at Atsoga Lake, and in later life, he saw old settlers trespassed in his land. Personal experience enabled Cooper to write intensely about the wilderness of American history and the lives of frontiersmen and their different cultures. Following this so-called early national period was the American Renaissance, also called the Romantic period in this country, and the age of Transcendentalism. Now, to those of you wondering what Transcendentalism is, it was an American literary movement that emphasized the importance and equality of the individual, rather than focusing on one large group. Also, during the time, we found American Gothic writers such as Edgar Allan Poe. One of my personal favorites, a man expelled by West Point, his work was often anything but romantic. His characters were drug addicted, insane, or both. Many were murderers. His stories often bordered on the macabre. However, contrary to popular belief, he himself was not an alcoholic or a drug addict. These rumors were started by a rival who was sore because Poe had written a rather unflattering review for a newspaper, because Edgar Allan Poe was also a critic. He became famous for writing rather scathing reviews. In fact, he became known as the Tomahawk Man. And regarding Transcendentalism, some famous authors of the period include Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. Emerson was one of the most important literary figures in his era, though he was accused of self-reliance, and being one with nature also played a heavy role in Transcendentalism. In fact, Ralph Waldo Emerson even wrote a book called Self-Reliance, and Thoreau kept a journal of his experiences at his cabin, and the book was published as On Walden Pond. Of course, following this, Romanticism and Transcendentalism was a period known as Realism, the most famous writer of whom was possibly also the first American writer to be born away from the East Coast. In the state of Missouri, that's right, I'm talking about Mark Twain, or perhaps you know him by his real name, Samuel Clemens. He wrote the memoir, The Life on Mississippi, and he drew personal experience in the books The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. He changed the way Americans write their language. His characters spoke like real people and sound distinctively American, using local dialects, newly invented words, and regional accents. And in fact, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is often seen as the first novel to be written in dialect. And of course, there was Henry James, who confronted the old world dilemma by writing directly about it. Among his more accessible works are the novel Daisy Miller, about an enchanting American Girl in Europe, and The Turn of the Screw, which was an enigmatic ghost story. And this brings us to the turn of the century. At the beginning of the 20th century, writers began expanding fiction's social spectrum to encompass both high and low life, and sometimes connected to the naturalist school of realism. More directly, political writings discussed social issues and the power of corporations, like Edward Bellamy did in his book, Looking Backward, which outlined other possible political and social frameworks. Upton Sinclair, who is most famous for his meatpacking novel, The Jungle, advanced socialism. In Henry Adams' literate autobiography, The Education of Henry Adams, also depicted a stinging description of the education system in modern life. We also began to see authors like F. Scott Fitzgerald, who captured the restless, pleasure-hungry, defiant mood of the 1920s. Expressed poignantly in The Great Gatsby is the tendency of youth's golden dream to dissolve in failure and disappointment. And we also have people like John Steinbeck, who was blunt and direct in his social criticism. His style was simple and evocative, winning him favor of the readers, but not of the critics. The Grapes of Wrath is considered his masterpiece. It is a strong, socially oriented novel that tells the story of the Jodes, a poor family from Oklahoma, and their journey to California to find a better life. That brings us today. Lord only knows how many novels have been published, and Lord only knows how many novels will be published in the future. So I would like my fellow writers out there to seek publishment of whatever works they have. You don't know. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take, as Michael Scott said in The Office. So go on. I believe in you. Goodbye, and God bless.